could be the most dangerous. An inflection point the Middle East has seen since the Yom Kippur War redrew the entire map of geopolitical power in this part of the world, because what unfolded in the hills and valleys of southern Lebanon is not just a military story. It is a story about intelligence failure, about a decade of underground preparation, about the most sophisticated non-state military force ever assembled on planet Earth, and about what happens when a nation that believes itself invincible walks into a trap that was laid years before the first shot was ever fired. Stay with this, because by the end, you will understand something about this conflict that most people watching from the outside have completely missed. To understand the full weight of what we are talking about, you have to understand who the Golani Brigade actually is. Not what they are on paper, but who they are in the blood and bone of Israeli military identity. The Golani Brigade is not just a unit. It is a symbol. It is the unit that stormed the Golan Heights in 1967 during the Six-Day War, when Israeli commanders told them the mission was near suicidal, and they went anyway. It is the unit that fought and bled in 1973 when Syrian tank columns poured into Israeli positions, and Golani soldiers held the line with anti-tank weapons, bare hands, and a refusal to break that became the stuff of legend. It is the unit that operated in South Lebanon for nearly 2 decades during the occupation from 1982 to 2000, losing hundreds of men in the grinding guerrilla war that Hezbollah used to eventually force an Israeli withdrawal. The Golani Brigade has a motto. It translates roughly as, "Golani is my family," and that is not marketing language. That is a psychological bond forged in decades of combat that makes this unit one of the most cohesive and battle-hardened ground forces anywhere in the world. When you hear that Golani soldiers suffered serious losses in a single engagement, you're not hearing about a routine military setback. You're hearing about something that shakes the very foundation of Israeli military confidence. That is the weight of what this story carries. Now let's go back to the beginning of 2026, because this war did not begin in a vacuum, and it did not begin without warning signs that, in retrospect, were impossible to miss for anyone paying attention. After the 2024 ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, a ceasefire that was always fragile, always contested, and almost daily violated by both sides in smaller ways, the situation on the ground in southern Lebanon continued to deteriorate quietly and steadily beneath the surface. Hezbollah never truly disarmed. Israeli airstrikes never truly stopped. The Lebanese state, weak and fractured as it has always been, was unable or unwilling to enforce the terms of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which theoretically required Hezbollah to withdraw north of the Litani River and surrender its weapons. None of that happened. Instead, what happened was that Hezbollah, with full Iranian backing, with Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps officers physically embedded in its command structure inside Lebanon, spent every single month of that ceasefire period doing something that would only become clear when the shooting started again. They were building. They were digging. They were rehearsing. They were preparing for a war they fully expected to come, and they were preparing for it with a level of discipline and strategic patience that is genuinely extraordinary for any military organization, state or non-state. On March 2nd, 2026, Israel launched what it publicly described as a preemptive military operation aimed at degrading Hezbollah's military infrastructure, before the group could execute what Israeli intelligence assessed as an imminent large-scale attack on northern Israel. The first day of the war was, by any measure, overwhelming in its intensity. Lebanese health authorities reported at least 31 people killed and 149 injured in the initial Israeli strikes, with 20 killed in Beirut's southern suburbs alone. The IDF announced the assassination of Hussein Makled, head of Hezbollah's intelligence headquarters, killed in overnight strikes in Beirut. Palestinian Islamic Jihad's commander in Lebanon was also killed in Beirut's southern suburbs. By nightfall of the first day, the death toll had risen to 52. Entire families were fleeing South Lebanon toward Sidon. Over 500,000 people would eventually be displaced. These were not small numbers. But compared to what was coming, the opening day was only the first act of a conflict that would escalate in ways that even the most pessimistic analysts watching this region had not fully anticipated. Here is what makes the 2026 Lebanon war fundamentally different from every previous round of fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. In 2006, Israel fought a war against a Hezbollah that had roughly 13,000 rockets, a few thousand trained fighters, and a command structure that, while effective, was still largely organized around guerrilla harassment tactics. By 2026, the organizate ion that Israel was fighting was something categorically, qualitatively different. Hezbollah in 2026 had an estimated 150,000 rockets and missiles, including precision-guided munitions capable of hitting specific buildings in Tel Aviv and Haifa. It had an estimated 40,000 to 100,000 trained fighters spread across Lebanon. But most critically, it had built an underground military city beneath southern Lebanon, a network of tunnels, command bunkers, weapons depots, fortified fighting positions, and underground communication. Lines that took over a decade to construct at a cost of billions of dollars, funded almost entirely by Iran. And the IRGC did not just send money, they sent engineers. They sent tunnel construction specialists, the same people who had built the labyrinthine tunnel systems in Gaza. They sent military doctrine specialists who had studied Israeli ground tactics exhaustively for 20 years. What they built in southern Lebanon was something that Israel had never fully mapped, never fully penetrated with its intelligence assets, and never truly understood the scale of until its soldiers were inside it. This is where the intelligence failure begins, and it is a failure of a very specific and familiar kind. When Israeli forces moved into southern Lebanon in the opening weeks of the 2026 war, they were operating on assessments that were, by subsequent account, significantly wrong at the most basic level. Pre-invasion estimates placed Hezbollah's active fighter strength in the specific operational sector that Israeli forces were entering at around 5,000 fighters. Ground commanders, within hours of making contact, were revising those numbers upward dramatically. Some estimates push the actual fighter count in that sector to Bint Jbeil district, and here is where the alarm bells should have been ringing loudest, because Bint Jbeil is not just any town in southern Lebanon. Bint Jbeil is where Hassan Nasrallah delivered his triumphant victory speech in the year 2000 when Israeli forces finally withdrew from Lebanon after 18 years of occupation. Hezbollah calls it the capital of resistance. Israel calls it the terror capital. In the 2006 war, Israeli forces entered Bint Jbeil, expecting a quick operation, and what they found instead was a battle that lasted weeks, cost significant Israeli lives, and ended without a clear Israeli victory. The lessons of 2006 Bint Jbeil were apparently not fully absorbed, because in 2026, Israeli forces entered the town again, into terrain that Hezbollah had spent 20 more years fortifying, tunneling beneath, and preparing as the ideal killing ground for any Israeli ground force that came in from the south. Hezbollah as a rocket force, an organization whose strategic power lies primarily in its ability to rain missiles down on Israeli cities. Far fewer people have a real understanding of the Radwan Force, which is Hezbollah's elite ground combat unit, created specifically for offensive operations inside Israeli territory and for defensive combat against Israeli ground forces in Lebanon. The Radwan Force fighters are not guerrillas in the traditional sense of irregular fighters taking potshots and fading into the population. They are trained in combined arms warfare, coordinating anti-tank missile teams with drone operators, with heavy machine gun positions, with IED, networks, with snipers, and with infantry in a way that creates overlapping, mutually reinforcing fields of fire from multiple directions simultaneously. They trained for years fighting in Syria, gaining real combat experience in some of the most brutally intense urban warfare environments of the entire 21st century. And when they came back to Lebanon, they were not the same organization that had fought Israel in 2006. They were harder, more experienced, more lethal. And they had spent years studying Israeli ground doctrine specifically to find the gaps. Command post with precision drones in the space between the towns of Ainata and Bint Jbeil. The IDF's Golani Brigade managed to seize the local hospital after intense close-quarters fighting, claiming to have killed 20 Hezbollah. Fighters inside and discovering a weapons cache within the building. The 98th Paratrooper Division entered the eastern districts alongside Golani and confronted Radwan units in the narrowest and most difficult urban terrain in southern Lebanon. By the time satellite imagery captured the state of Bint Jbeil's town center, it was unrecognizable, rubble and ruins in every direction. The cost of that destruction, on both sides, was real and significant. Now let's address the central question directly and honestly. The claim of 350 Israeli soldiers killed in a single day in a Hezbollah ambush of the Golani Brigade. This specific number has spread aggressively across social media, YouTube channels, and various alternative and fringe media outlets. So what does the evidence actually show? The figure of 350 IDF dead in a single engagement has not been confirmed by Israeli military. Authorities, by Israeli media, which operates under military censorship during wartime but still reports individual soldier deaths, or by any verified international news organization. What we know with absolute certainty is that Israeli casualties in the 2026 Lebanon war have been real, documented, and sustained. What we also know is that the figure of 357 dead on a single day in April 2026 is a very real number, but it refers not to Israeli soldiers killed in an ambush. It refers to Lebanese citizens and Hezbollah fighters killed in Israeli airstrikes during Operation Eternal Darkness, the IDF's most devastating single-day bombardment of the entire war. That number, 357, appears to have been extracted, inverted, repackaged, and weaponized in the information war that runs in parallel to every kinetic conflict in the modern media landscape. But here is what makes this more complicated than a straightforward debunking story, and here is where things get genuinely interesting. The claim of catastrophic Golani losses does not exist in a total vacuum. It exists inside a broader context of genuine, documented reasons to believe that Israel's casualty reporting during the 2026 Lebanon war has been significantly incomplete and deliberately delayed. Israeli military censorship laws give the IDF extensive authority to withhold casualty figures during active combat. Families of fallen soldiers are notified privately. Public announcements are delayed. This creates a systematic gap, sometimes a gap of days, sometimes longer, between actual battlefield losses and officially reported numbers. Independent analysts, tracking the geographic patterns of Israeli tactical operations in southern Lebanon during specific weeks, noted something striking. The patterns were consistent with units that had suffered serious losses and were consolidating and regrouping rather than advancing. The timing of the sudden and dramatic Israeli pivot toward massive aerial bombardment in early April, after several weeks of intense ground combat, is entirely consistent with a military that encountered serious setbacks on the ground and shifted to the domain where it holds overwhelming advantage. The information war around this conflict is itself a weapon of strategic importance. Hezbollah maintains an entire media apparatus, Al-Manar television, multiple social media operations, and a network of aligned regional outlets, dedicated specifically to amplifying narratives of Israeli military failure and suffering. Iran's state media serves as a global amplifier for everything that makes Israel look weak or vulnerable. And on the Israeli side, military censorship combined with a deeply ingrained institutional tendency to frame every operation as a success, regardless of actual tactical outcomes, creates the perfect environment in which both official propaganda and counter-propaganda flourish simultaneously. The truth in war, as it has always been, as it was in 1973, as it was in 2006, and as it is in 2026, sits somewhere between the official statements and the most dramatic viral claims. And finding it requires watching what each side does, rather than listening to what each side says. What Israel did in April 2026, launching Operation Eternal Darkness, the single largest bombardment campaign of the entire war, tells you something profound about the state of mind in the Israeli military and political leadership at that moment. Nations do not launch their most devastating air campaign of an entire war without a reason that goes beyond pure strategy. There was urgency in it. There was a response embedded in it. On April 8th, 2026, Operation Eternal Darkness unfolded, and the scale was staggering enough to draw global condemnation at a level and from a breadth of countries that even Israel had rarely seen before. At least 357 people were killed, the single highest daily death toll of the entire war. The IDF said it struck over 100 targets and killed at least 250 militants in 100 airstrikes that were carried out in densely populated areas. Lebanese President Joseph Aoun called it a massacre and declared a national day of mourning and a public holiday. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres condemned the Aasim attacks unequivocally. UN Human Rights Commissioner Volker Turk called the scenes horrific. Doctors Without Borders reported its healthcare staff were injured by Israeli forces at Hiram Hospital in Tyre and reported extensive damage to the facility. 3 girls were killed in a strike on the coastal town of Adlun. An Israeli airstrike hit a cemetery in the Bekai Valley village of Shmustar during an active funeral, killing at least 10 mourners. Associated Press journalists on the ground in Beirut reported seeing charred bodies at one of the city's busiest intersections in the Corniche al-Mazrah neighborhood. The Israeli military said it killed Ali Yusuf Harshi, the nephew and personal secretary of Hezbollah leader Naim Qassem in Beirut. This was not precision warfare. This was overwhelming force, and the world took notice. 29 countries plus the United Nations condemned the strikes. That list included France, calling the strikes unacceptable. It included Canada and Australia. It included countries that obstructing the external perimeter's visibility. For Israel to be accused of deliberately targeting UN peacekeepers, not through the fog of war, but through repeated documented incidents, is a level of international isolation that carries long-term strategic costs that are difficult to calculate in the short term, but will be felt for decades. Now step back and look at the 1973 comparison with full precision, because this comparison keeps surfacing, and it is not casual hyperbole. It is geopolitically and historically precise in specific ways that matter enormously. In October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated, perfectly synchronized surprise attack on Israel on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, when Israeli society was fasting, praying, and completely off guard. The first days of that war were catastrophic for Israel. On the Golan Heights, 177 Israeli tanks faced approximately 400 Syrian tanks. Golani soldiers held positions against odds that should have been militarily impossible, and many of them died doing so. In the Sinai, Egyptian forces crossed the Suez Canal in a masterstroke of operational planning and overran Israeli Bar-Lev line fortifications in hours. The total IDF death toll in the 1973 war exceeded 2,500 soldiers. The psychological shock to Israeli society was profound and generational. It triggered a national commission of inquiry under Justice Agranat that ultimately forced Prime Minister Golda Meir and Defense Minister Moshe Dayan to resign. It brought down a government. It fundamentally changed how Israel approached military preparedness, intelligence assessment, and strategic planning for the next 50 years. The reason serious analysts are reaching for the 1973 comparison in 2026 is not simply about raw casualty numbers. It is about the nature of the potential failure. In 1973, Israel was not defeated by a more powerful military. It was blindsided by its own arrogance, by a fixed belief about how enemies would behave that overrode every contradictory warning sign in the weeks before the attack. Israeli intelligence analysts have a specific term for this collective cognitive blindness. They call it the concept, a hardened assumption about enemy behavior that becomes impervious to disconfirming evidence. In 1973, the concept was that Egypt would not attack without air power capable of neutralizing Israeli air superiority. Egypt attacked anyway, with a missile screen instead. The concept was wrong. The concern in 2026 is whether something structurally identical happened with Hezbollah, whether decades of successful targeted assassinations, of air power dominance, of technological superiority in every visible domain, create a new concept that minimized Hezbollah as a ground threat, that dismissed the tunnel networks, that underestimated the Radwan force, and that led Israeli planners to enter southern Lebanon without fully grasping what had been built there over 10 years of patient, Iranian-funded IRGC-supervised military construction. By mid-April 2026, Lebanon's Public Health Emergency Operations Center released numbers that told the full scale of what was happening. Israeli attacks since March 2nd had killed 2,055 people and wounded a further 6,588. Over 1 million Lebanese had been displaced, 20% of the entire country's population. These are not the casualty figures of a limited counterterrorism operation. These are the casualty figures of a full-scale war of the kind that Lebanon has not seen since the worst years of its civil war in the 1980s. And they are being generated in a country of roughly 5 million people in the space of 6 weeks with no end in sight. The humanitarian dimension of this conflict is generating political pressure on governments around the world that will accumulate over months and years and will reshape Israel's diplomatic relationships in ways that military victories cannot compensate for. Iran's role in all of this deserves examination with the precision it demands, because the shorthand phrase Iran-backed that appears in virtually every news report about Hezbollah often functions as a lazy label that fundamentally understates the true depth of the relationship. IRGC officers were not advising Hezbollah remotely from Tehran. They were embedded in Hezbollah's operational command structure inside Lebanon. They were present in planning rooms. Iranian military engineers designed and supervised the construction of the tunnel networks that Israeli forces encountered in southern Lebanon. Iranian money, estimated at over $1 billion annually at various points, funded the precision missile program that transformed Hezbollah from a rocket-firing force into an organization capable of hitting specific GPS coordinates. The relationship between Iran and Hezbollah is not the relationship between a sponsor and a proxy. It has evolved over 40 years into something much closer to a full military integration. Two forces sharing intelligence, personnel, doctrine, logistics, and long-term strategic planning in ways that sanctions, assassinations, and airstrikes have repeatedly failed to permanently disrupt. Israel's targeted killing campaign against Hezbollah's leadership over 30 years is a useful lens for understanding how hard Israel has tried to break this organization and how comprehensively, structurally, it has failed. In September 2024, Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah, the most consequential single assassination of a militant leader since Osama bin Laden, arguably more significant in regional terms given Nasrallah's 30-year construction of Hezbollah as a state within a state with an army, a social welfare system, a political bloc, and a global financial network. Nasrallah died. Hezbollah was still launching a new war from Lebanon 18 months later. In April 2026, Israeli forces killed Haj Yusuf Ismail Hashem, the commander of Hezbollah's southern front. Hezbollah confirmed his death and called it their harshest loss since November 2025. And then they kept fighting. They always keep fighting, because the institution is larger than any individual within it, because the infrastructure is distributed across tens of thousands of people and thousands of physical locations, and decades of embedded social structure. And because the targeted killing of leadership, while operationally disruptive, has never once in 40 years produced the organizational collapse that it was designed to produce. The broader geopolitical stakes of what is happening in Lebanon in 2026 stretch far beyond Israel and Hezbollah. Saudi Arabia is watching, Turkey is watching. Every government in the Arab world, in Europe, and in the great powers is recalculating based on what this war is demonstrating about the real-world military balance in the Middle East. For years, the strategic assumption in regional power politics was that Hezbollah's value to Iran was primarily deterrent, a loaded weapon pointed at Israel's north that prevented Israel from attacking Iran's nuclear program by threatening devastating retaliation. If Hezbollah demonstrated in 2026 that it can inflict serious losses on Israel's ground forces in prepared defensive terrain, that deterrent calculus becomes significantly more powerful. Iran's position in nuclear negotiations, in conversations about regional security architecture, in every bilateral relationship where military capability matters, changes when the world has seen that Hezbollah can fight and hurt the IDF. Conversely, if Israel ultimately succeeds in significantly degrading Hezbollah's military infrastructure through this war, destroying the tunnel networks, pushing fighters back, eliminating senior commanders faster than they can be replaced, Iran loses its most powerful forward-deployed military asset, and the strategic equation shifts dramatically in the other direction. That is the stakes underlying every airstrike, every ground operation, and every ceasefire negotiation in this conflict. What comes next is the question that every serious analyst is trying to answer. And the honest answer is that the conditions for a genuine resolution simply do not exist. A ceasefire is nominally in effect, but it is a ceasefire in the same sense that the 2024 ceasefire was, a pause in active large-scale hostilities that neither side treats as a genuine end to the underlying conflict. Israeli forces remain positioned south of the Litani River in a security zone they have established by force. Hezbollah is rebuilding its presence in areas that Israeli forces have moved through and partially destroyed. The Lebanese state, led by President Joseph Aoun, is pressing for a genuine peace process, calling for Israeli withdrawal from Lebanese territory in exchange for Lebanese army deployment in the south and a path toward Hezbollah's disarmament. Israel's position is that no withdrawal happens before disarmament. Hezbollah's position is that disarmament is not a subject of negotiation under any circumstances. These positions are not merely incompatible at the margins, they are structurally, fundamentally irreconcilable, which means the ceasefire will hold until the next trigger, and when it breaks, both sides will begin from a new and more dangerous baseline. The deepest and most consequential question at the center of this entire story is one that will not be fully answered for years, possibly decades. Did something happen in the valleys and hills of southern Lebanon in the spring of 2026 that genuinely changed the fundamental military calculus of the Middle East? Not the viral claim, not the unverified number, not the social media narrative, but the actual ground-level reality of what Israeli forces encountered when they moved into Hezbollah's decade-long prepared defensive architecture. Because if the answer to that question is yes, if Israeli commanders emerged from Bint Jebel, from the tunnels of southern Lebanon, from the drone strikes on their command posts, having genuinely learned that Hezbollah's ground force has evolved into something qualitatively different from what they prepared for, then the implications are enormous and lasting. Israel will be forced to rethink its ground combat doctrine. It will have to reckon seriously with the reality that air superiority, while decisive against exposed infrastructure and many military targets, is not sufficient to defeat an adversary that fights from underground, that disperses across civilian terrain in ways that make clean targeting impossible, and that has had 10 years of Iranian engineering support to build defenses specifically optimized against the way Israel fights. And the armies of the world are watching this war with the attention of students in the most important classroom of the century. Military planners in Washington, in Moscow, in Beijing, in Ankara, in New Delhi, and in Tehran are studying the 2026 Lebanon war in real time. They are studying what worked for Hezbollah against Israeli armor and ground forces, and what didn't. They are studying what worked for Israel's air campaign and what its limitations are. They are drawing conclusions about urban warfare, about the role of drones in combined arms operations, about the power of prepared underground defensive networks against technologically superior attackers, about what a non-state actor with state-level resources and a decade of disciplined preparation can actually achieve against one of the world's most sophisticated and battle-tested military machines. These lessons of this war will be taught in military academies for a generation. They will shape procurement decisions, they will reshape doctrine, they will influence how the next 10 conflicts in this world are planned and fought. The last time Israel was shocked at this depth, it was 1973. And that shock led to transformation. It produced reform. It produced a harder, more intellectually honest, more strategically humble Israeli military that went on to dominate regional warfare for the next 50 years. Whether 2026 produces the same quality of reckoning, whether this moment becomes the catalyst for a genuine reassessment of Israeli ground doctrine, of intelligence methodology, of the assumptions embedded in the planning for this war, that story is still being written in real time. What we know with certainty is that the valleys of southern Lebanon in 2026 were not the walkover that any planning document predicted. What we know is that Hezbollah fought with a capability that surprised even those who had been watching it grow. What we know is that Israel responded with massive, devastating force. The exact numbers of what was lost on both sides are contested, obscured by censorship on one side and propaganda on the other, buried under the fog of a war that is not yet over. But the reality underneath the numbers, the reality of a military confrontation that shook one of the world's most formidable